Have you ever noticed how often politicians break their promises? It's shocking, but studies show that about 70% of campaign pledges go unfulfilled. In fact, according to a study from the University of California, only 15% of voters believe their leaders keep their promises. These numbers raise an important question: why do we keep believing them? Imagine this: a politician stands on a stage, promising to improve education, lower taxes, and create jobs. The crowd cheers, and voters feel hopeful. Yet, once elected, many of these promises fade away. You might think, surely they want to keep their word. But the reality is far more complicated. In this video, we'll dive into the intriguing world of broken campaign promises. We'll explore the sneaky strategies politicians use to craft empty promises, how powerful lobbyists pull the strings behind the scenes, and why voter memory plays a huge role in all of this. By the end, you'll understand why campaign promises often become just words that fade into the background of political noise. So, buckle up. We're about to uncover the truth behind the promises that shape our political landscape. Prepare to see politics in a whole new light. Chapter 1: The Art of the Empty Promise. Politicians have mastered the art of making promises that sound too good to ignore. They know exactly how to hit the right emotional chords with voters. But here's the catch: many of these promises are deliberately designed to be vague. According to political analyst George Lakoff, framing a message is key. It's not just what you say, but how you say it. Candidates focus on broad, popular issues, like education or healthcare, without going into the details. Why? Because details can lose votes. In fact, a study by the Pew Research Center found that only 20% of voters remember the specific policy promises a candidate makes. The rest remember the tone, emotion, or general impression. Politicians rely on this memory gap. They use buzzwords that sound progressive, like reform or transformation, which appeal to a wide audience but leave plenty of wiggle room for interpretation. Take this for example: I will fix the healthcare system. It's a classic empty promise. What does fix even mean? It can mean different things to different people, allowing candidates to appeal to both sides of the aisle without committing to a specific course of action. When candidates make these promises, they're not lying per se, they're just leaving themselves a backdoor. Chapter 2: The Smoke and Mirrors of Lobbyists. The second way campaign promises fall apart is behind closed doors, thanks to the influence of lobbyists. You might think a politician works for the people, but in many cases, they're catering to powerful lobby groups. According to Dark Money by Jane Mayer, corporate lobbying spending exceeds $3 billion a year in Washington. That's more than the combined budgets of the House and Senate. Politicians often make campaign promises that they know they can't keep, because the real decisions are being influenced by money. In 2020, over 80% of Americans supported lowering prescription drug prices, yet Congress has struggled to pass meaningful legislation on this. Why? Pharmaceutical companies spent $306 million lobbying Congress that year. Politicians make grand promises about healthcare reform, but when they get into office, lobbyists convince them to rethink their positions. Interestingly, research by Princeton University shows that the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near-zero impact upon public policy. In contrast, the preferences of wealthy Americans and organized interest groups have a much higher likelihood of shaping policy. This is how campaign promises get silently altered or delayed in favor of corporate interests. Chapter 3: Bureaucratic Roadblocks. When promises hit a wall. Even when a politician genuinely wants to fulfill a campaign promise, the bureaucratic machinery can be a formidable barrier. Government isn't a simple switch that can be flipped overnight. Policies need to go through layers of approval, committees, votes, amendments, and even lawsuits. In 2012, President Obama promised comprehensive immigration reform, but it stalled for years. Despite control of both houses of Congress early in his presidency, the reforms got bogged down in political infighting and procedural delays. A report by the Congressional Research Service states that only about 2% of bills introduced in Congress become law. That's a staggering bottleneck for change. One example is the infrastructure promises made by many candidates. Fixing roads and bridges sounds simple, right? But the reality is that these projects can take years, sometimes decades, to even get started because of zoning laws, environmental regulations, and budget constraints. Sometimes, bureaucracy even rewrites promises. Take healthcare again, something every politician loves to discuss. When Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, ACA, many of its original promises were altered or watered down by special committees. The result was a law that didn't exactly match what voters were promised, but it was the best that could survive the bureaucratic gauntlet. It's like a game of telephone, the message gets twisted along the way. This creates an easy out for politicians. They can blame the system for their failures while knowing full well that many of these obstacles existed before they even made the promise. If you're enjoying this exploration of campaign promises and the strategies behind them, make sure to subscribe for more insightful content on politics and how it affects you. Chapter 4: The Voter Amnesia Effect. Here's a little secret that politicians count on, voters forget. The voter amnesia effect allows politicians to break promises without much backlash. According to a Gallup poll, only about 30% of voters follow political news closely enough to notice when promises are broken. That means the majority don't keep track. Politicians are also good at distracting us. When a promise is broken, something else grabs headlines. A scandal, a crisis, or even a new set of promises for the next election cycle can shift attention. Take Brexit, for example. During the 2016 referendum, promises were made about saving billions and improving healthcare. But after the vote, those promises faded. Instead, new debates took over, and many voters simply moved on. Politicians also know how to shift blame. "The other side is blocking me" is a common excuse, and it often works. By pointing fingers at the opposition or unexpected crises, leaders deflect responsibility. It's a clever way to sidestep accountability. It works, too. A 2018 study by Pew Research found that nearly 50% of voters couldn't name a single policy change that a politician they supported had failed to deliver. Voter amnesia isn't just a random phenomenon, it's almost strategic. Politicians know election cycles are short, and memories fade fast. By the time the next election rolls around, voters are ready to believe the next round of promises. As a result, broken promises often don't hurt a politician's career nearly as much as you'd expect. Chapter 5: Power Shifts, How Elections Rewrite Agendas. Another major reason campaign promises get broken. Power shifts. Every election can flip the balance of power in Washington or in state governments. A politician may have the best intentions, but if they lose control of Congress or face a hostile governor, their promises can easily crumble. Take the case of Barack Obama's pledge to close Guantanamo Bay. He made this promise as part of his 2008 campaign. But when Republicans gained control of Congress in 2010, they blocked funding needed to move detainees and close the prison. Despite his best efforts, Obama couldn't deliver on this signature promise. When one party controls the executive branch, but the other holds the legislative branch, gridlock becomes the norm. In 2019, the Brookings Institution found that partisan polarization in Congress was at an all-time high, making it nearly impossible for either side to pass meaningful legislation. Even bipartisan issues get tangled in this web. Shifting political power also affects the Supreme Court. Decisions made by the highest court can directly impact the president's ability to follow through on promises. For example, President Biden pledged to cancel student loan debt. However, in 2023, the Supreme Court struck down his plan, leaving millions of borrowers disappointed. Shifting the political landscape isn't just about changing parties, it's about how those changes make fulfilling promises much harder. If you found this deep dive into the complexities of campaign promises insightful, don't forget to subscribe. Join us as we continue to unravel the intricacies of politics and empower yourself as a more informed voter.